recording for Chapter 3, the first of two chapters that considers the external environment. In Chapter 3, we talk about two specific parts of the external environment, the political, legal, and the economic forces. So in this chapter, we will start with a brief overview of the macro environment, which spans both chapters 3 and 4. And we will talk about political legal forces, including a discussion of global regulations and protectionism. And then we will close with a discussion of economic forces. Now let's start with a couple of comments about the macro environment. Now, macro environment is another term for external environment. They mean the same thing. Now, macro environmental forces affect entire industries and individual firms within industries. We might use a couple of examples here of individual firms, but our focus here is on the industry. In other words, we want to know what makes the industry tick and how specific forces affect an industry. We'll narrow this down and talk about how it affects a particular firm, perhaps the one you're doing for a case project, a little bit later. Now, certain forces may be more prominent in some industries than in others. So you might have, let's say, political legal forces being very important in one particular industry, and maybe economic forces are important in another. That's okay. Again, the focus is on seeing how the different categories influence an industry of interest. Now, macro-environmental forces can be divided into four categories. The first two of these, again, political, legal, and economic, are the focus of this chapter. Social forces and technological forces are addressed in the next chapter. Collectively, these forces are sometimes referred to as PEST, P for political legal, E for economic, S for social, and T for technological. So if you hear of a PEST analysis, sometimes this is called PESTEL with two additional elements in the acronym. It's really talking about the different categories of forces that affect industries. Now, a side comment here, sometimes when you look at PEST analysis online, you will sometimes see that it is applied to a firm and not to an industry. Now, this can be done, but it's not the most precise way of doing this analysis. You really should start with looking at the industry, understand how these forces affect the entire industry, and then hone in on your company, because it gives you an opportunity to see how some of these forces might affect your company differently from other companies in the same industry. So let's start with political legal forces. Several categories of specific forces that come into the political legal group here. The first is the outcomes of elections. Certainly if you're in the United States, you're aware of the 2016 election of President Donald Trump and how that has changed not just government business relationships, but it's had an outcome or an effect on a lot of laws that were passed and different rulings that have occurred since that time. The president, of course, influences legislation, but legislation comes from Congress. At the state level, legislation can also occur from state houses, and even at the individual level, you can have different town decisions that affect communities and locales within states. There are also judicial court decisions. If you have a decision, especially one made by the Supreme Court, that might look at healthcare requirements that must be administered, or maybe minimum wage laws, or even overtime restrictions. Those decisions impact industries and sometimes impact all businesses in the entire jurisdiction. Now, one area that's often underrepresented in this discussion is governmental agency activity, because when Congress passes a law in the U.S., it often delegates the enforcement of that to regulators, and they then create their own laws and that's what you have to follow. So Congress might say, we think minimum wage should be $10, and then they hand it off to Department of Labor, maybe another department, to administer in terms of enforcement. And that enforcement mechanism becomes the specific requirements that must be met by individual companies and industries. Now, there's some examples of recent U.S. legislation, and here's just a few of them. Your book provides some more, but again, even the ones in the book are just a very, very short list of a lot of different possibilities, but just to give you a flavor of how these can affect different industries. In 2002, we had the Pension Security Act, as a lot of legislation is. This was a response to a crisis in the country, and it gave workers more freedom to diversify their investments, and greater access to quality investment life advice concerning their 401k plans. The idea is that a company should not be providing you a retirement plan and putting all of the retirement or a big chunk of it into the stock of that particular company. If the company goes under, then there goes your retirement. The Can-Spam Act of 2003, one of my favorites because this prescribed rules and penalties for email spammers. And again, we can just sort of see from this example that legislation doesn't necessarily solve problems. Spam seems to be as much of a problem today as it ever was. The Net Neutrality Act of 2015, very interesting piece of legislation looking at internet service providers. And it said they must enable access to all content and applications regardless of the source. So they can't favor certain companies or providers based on the demand that they provide. So they can't favor or block products or websites. They have to provide that consistent access regardless of the source. 2017, we had the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This was a signature piece of legislation in the Trump administration and overhauled the U.S. tax code and included permanent reductions in corporate tax rates as well. It also eliminated the individual mandate in the 2010 Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. This was known as Obamacare. We did not put this on the list, but that would be yet another piece of legislation that has affected a lot of industries. Now, regulation can be costly to a lot of firms, but sometimes firms actually get behind legislation, and often they'll do so in the name of safety or being a good corporate citizen, but sometimes they can create entry barriers, a topic we discussed in the previous chapter. An example of a regulation that's interesting in terms of the auto industry is back when President Obama increased the average gas mileage, these are called CAFE standards, if you look those up, to 55 miles per gallon by year 2025. And what this essentially says is that the typical car or average car that you produce has to meet a certain average mileage along the way in order to meet that 55 mpg requirement by the year 2025. Now, there were analysts that estimated that production costs would rise as much as $3,000 per vehicle to meet that requirement. There's been some studies that have followed up, and it does show an increase in expenses. It is always difficult to tell exactly how much a product like a vehicle will have to increase in production cost to meet different regulations. Supporters of the legislation say that, well, even though it does cost more to produce a product that meets those standards, the fuel economy also reduces costs in terms of buying gas at the pump. So all of that can be debated. If we look at the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act back of 2010, so when we referenced a couple of slides ago, this increased regulations on healthcare providers and insurance companies to lower costs and expand coverage. And even today, the short and long-term effects are widely debated. Now, there are a couple of specific categories that are addressed in the text, and these are developed in a lot of detail. I certainly recommend you take a look at those. The first example is food consumption. Okay, this looks at the production, processing, and consumption of food. It's been heavily regulated in the United States for years, other parts of the world as well, but certainly in the U.S. Some of the recent areas of interest are things like the amount of sugar in products, fat content, the use of GMOs, and it's the large firms like McDonald's that are always under attack. So even though you see factors affecting the entire fast food industry, for example, often they're targeting specific companies within that industry. The second example is automobiles, and the auto industry is also heavily regulated worldwide. And in the U.S., manufacturers have to meet those CAFE standards we talked about, as well as various safety requirements. What's interesting is meeting those two categories of requirements can actually work against each other. For example, the easiest way to increase fuel economy is to build a lighter car. If you build a lighter car, use less steel or some lighter weight components in the vehicle, and sometimes that can make the vehicle less safe. So these are competing requirements that are mandated through regulation. Interesting piece of legislation was the 2009 CARS program, also called Cash for Clunkers. And what it did is subsidize the purchase of a new car for Americans who wanted to trade in their old one, ostensibly for a more fuel-efficient new vehicle. And this artificially increased demand in the industry. It's interesting, if you look at the demand patterns while this program was going on, a lot of people went and traded in their vehicle. It didn't have to be running at all. You just simply got a certain amount of money on the trade-in, courtesy of the government, in order to buy a new vehicle. So it did help the automakers temporarily, but once the program was over, then the demand not only returned to normal levels, but it actually went below normal levels for a while because people accelerated their purchasing during this time period. It's interesting to look at global trends in terms of political legal forces. And historically, if you look at the time of World War II, you see a lot of regulation and protectionism after that period. And there was a lot of fear about different countries gaining power and ultimately ending up in war. But this gradually shifted toward free trade by the 1980s all the way through the 2000s. Now we see tariffs that accompany the China-U.S. trade dispute that started when President Trump was elected, but it's difficult to tell if these tariffs represent a long-term trend toward protectionism because in many respects the tariffs are not part of an economic philosophy, but more part of a means of negotiating a greater trade deal. Now in the U.S., the trend has shifted back toward greater regulation in the late 2000s. As the financial crisis prompted that shift, and then the election of President Obama. But it hasn't been a hard shift. There's still a sense that we need some balance of free trade and more modest regulation. With each new election in the United States, you see some different changes that take place as well. Let's talk about the economic forces. Some of the broad categories you see in economic forces include the gross domestic product, or GDP, of different countries. Recessions that occur. A recession officially is when you have a decline in GDP for 2 consecutive quarters. What about inflation rates? Rates of inflation that occur. How does that affect particular industries? What about interest rates? Do interest rates affect all industries the same way? What about exchange rates? Or if a dollar exchanges for so many yen from Japan or so many euros from the EU, if that changes, goes up or down by 10%, how does that affect global business? Well, let's talk about a few of these. A recession doesn't hurt all industries equally. You would think that a poor economy would hurt every industry, but it doesn't. In fact, there's some industries that benefit. If you're a deep discount retailer, for example, you might benefit from a recession because people trade down, or in other words, they actually purchase their goods from lower price providers. Pawn shops, movie theaters, these are examples of companies that sometimes do well during poor economic times. Inflation, interest rates are also kind of interesting as well. Interest rates affect the purchase of big ticket items. Now, a lot of people carry debt. A lot of Americans carry credit card debt, so they're affected by interest rates. But the interest rate at a particular time, like if the rate were to go up substantially, is going to have its greatest impact on the purchase of maybe major appliances or vehicles or even homes, because those are big ticket items that are financed in many instances. In fact, if you think about houses, home is probably the best example. If you're going to buy a house, very few people pay cash for it. Most people finance it over time, have a mortgage over 10, 20, 30 years, and the interest rate can dramatically affect the monthly payment. So interest rates go up. Those who build homes are affected. Those who sell homes are affected. Even those who provide home improvement services, companies like Lowe's and Home Depot, can be affected. What about exchange rates? Well, if you have a strong dollar versus a weak dollar, that can have a huge impact on global trade, because a 10% change in the exchange rate can make products 10% more expensive or 10% less expensive when they are sent from one country to another. So if you see, for example, a 10% change with China, you might see a product that's sold in China for $1 now sells for $1.10. Okay, well, what is a dollar worth? Well, it depends, because we spend dollars in the U.S., but in China they spend their own currency, the renminbi or the yuan. So when we think about a product shifting in terms of its value in the home currency, it doesn't mean the same abroad. So when you have that 10% change, it's not necessarily reflected in terms of dollars. To us, a dollar is a dollar, but to someone in China, it might be from 10 renminbi to 11, and that change would impact the demand for those products. Now, just to sum up some of these considerations, when the dollar declines in value, U.S. exports become less expensive. This is for this reason, a lot of countries will artificially weaken their currencies because it makes it easier for them to export their products abroad, at least in the short term. There's some reasons why this doesn't necessarily occur in the long run, but it does occur in the short term. And as we said before, a good economy is not good for all industries. Some industries actually do better when the economy's not doing well. But what about tariffs? Tariffs hurt customers or consumers as they're essentially a tax on a particular purchase of a good. So a tariff, say in products that are sent from China to the United States, raises the price of those products in the U.S. Tariffs are not just absorbed by the producers or the wholesalers or retailers, they ultimately get passed along. Ideally, they should be eliminated. It's in everybody's best interest to promote that trade. Certainly in terms of tariffs in the context of trade disputes, often they're used as weapons, not necessarily because those individuals instituting the tariffs believe that they're the best economic policy. Now, when you think also about ecological influences, we put these in the economic category because although they are sort of their own group of concerns, they have economic influences or impacts on different industries. And ecological influences can alter the cost structures of an entire industry. Now, they're often intertwined with political legal forces because it's the governments that attempt to manage economic development and address ecological concerns with regulations. So if the government steps in and institutes a requirement on recycling, for example, or maybe one that relates to climate change, it will be passed down and will have significant effects on an entire industry. Well, this brings up the topic of what we call anthropogenic or human-induced climate change. And just a quick synopsis of this debate that goes on, there's a notion that human activity, which is specifically referring to heavy manufacturing, has had a substantial effect on global weather patterns. And this is sort of the prevailing logic among many in business and government today. And the proponents of this view, contend that carbon dioxide produced by human activity is the culprit, and that essentially is from manufacturing. And because firms emit a significant amount of CO2 into the atmosphere, they must voluntarily reduce their carbon footprint. It's a term we hear frequently, by modifying their production processes, or governments should step in and require them to do so involuntarily. So the idea here is to regulate production so that production doesn't produce so much CO2 that it influences weather patterns in a negative way. This is the argument for anthropogenic climate change. Now, the argument against it is interesting as well. The critics question the causal link between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and global temperatures. Actually, if you look at the data, sometimes it goes the other way around, that the temperature changes and then the CO2 levels change afterwards. The critics also note that the Earth has been warming and cooling for millennia long before there was ever any heavy manufacturing, and so it's sometimes difficult just to assume that the human activity or the carbon dioxide production by manufacturing has been the real culprit. But regardless of the position you take on this issue, whether you believe that human-induced activity is driving climate change or it's really more of a minor factor, the consumers expect firms to take reasonable action to protect the environment. Things like recycling or recovering waste from the oceans, these are important things. So regardless of your view on this particular issue, you have to think in terms of what your company response should be. And industries are affected substantially by this particular issue. This brings us to a close with case analysis steps 5 and 6, and this is the identification of political, legal, and economic forces. Here you identify the specific political, legal, which is step 5, and the economic and ecological, step 6, forces that affect the industry in question. Again, we're talking about specific forces, not just a long list of possibilities. We don't want to list GDP and exchange rates. We want to talk specifically about how GDP in a certain country, or maybe a change in exchange rate between Japan and the United States, how those forces are affecting the particular industry. In practical terms, this often requires a paragraph of explanation, some details. This is not something that's done at a cursory level. It also requires a lot of research. Again, the focus here is on the industry, not the firm. We'll get to specific applications to the firm later in the analysis. So this concludes our audio commentary for Chapter 3.